So, Thomas, I'm not sure how you curate your music online, but in the attempt to start this podcast with ever more obscure user prompts from weird and wonderful apps across the internet, I found one that might be suitable for you. So there's an app called Dissonant, which sends you physical music, so CDs and I think vinyls as well, based upon your tastes, with a very nice handwritten note from one of its personal curators. It's a very sweet kind of retro music app that I might well subscribe to now. And on one of its kind of screens, it has a call to action that says, if you don't like it, send it back, because it has a free mailing policy. So I'm asking you, as you debut on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, what would you like to send back?
Ben, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to join you. I think what I would send back is the initial drafts of the data sharing agreements that we were given by the platforms as we set up our out-of-court dispute settlement service. Although, Ben, I will not tell you what my handwritten note said on top of those drafts.
Yeah, not suitable for a podcast such as Ctrl-Alt-Speech.
No slow words on this.
In terms of my thing I'd like to send back, well, I've had a few moderation decisions in my time that I've been subject to, which I would like to return and have marked again. And I think that's a very nice segue into you and what you do in today's podcast. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's October the 9th, 2025, and this week we're talking about public confidence in big platforms, Discord data leaks, and the creative use of anti-hate speech policies. I'm Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation, and I'm joined this week by not Mike Basnek, who is traveling as we speak, but with Thomas Hughes. Thomas, welcome to the podcast today.
Ben, thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I'll give you a bit of an intro to Thomas. Thomas is the CEO of Appeals Centre Europe, an out-of-court dispute settlement body. And he said that if I mention the URL of Appeals Centre, his comms team will be very, very happy. So I'm pleased to say that appealscentre.eu is where you go to find out more. We'll learn about Thomas's work, but I really wanted him on the podcast this week because he's got a lot of experience working at the Oversight Board, the Supreme Court style body set up by Meta to advise on some of its content moderation decisions, and also at Article 19 before that. So he brings a wealth of experience. Before we get into it, Thomas, how do you curate your music playlists online? I'm presuming you're not quite using Dissonant yet.
I wasn't expecting that question, Ben. I just trial and error, I think. Trial and error.
Yeah, me too. I don't have a real set policy of doing it as well. But it's great to have you here either way. I think the out-of-court dispute settlement bodies are fascinating. Your appearance on Ctrl-Alt-Speech is very timely as well, because you've got a report out recently that talks a bit about this fascinating area. I'll leave you to explain what ACE does specifically, but as background for listeners, you'll know about the Digital Services Act, the EU's kind of big, bold attempt to regulate platforms to create a safer internet. It includes an article called Article 21, which allowed for the creation of organizations called ODS bodies, out-of-court dispute settlement bodies or online dispute settlement bodies, that help users appeal moderation decisions. Now, I felt like this, when this came out, when this was announced, it was one of the most interesting things that have happened since the advent of the report button many, many years ago on the earliest platforms. It gives users a real accountability and transparency that they haven't really had for a long time. And these ODS bodies, they review cases from users, as Thomas would explain. They solicit information from platforms and they deliver a judgment to those users. And these can be anything from where users have been taken down from the platform themselves, had their accounts blocked, or on particular posts. Whilst these decisions are non-binding, they obviously offer a resolution which otherwise would be very difficult for users to get. And so this is why I wanted Thomas to kind of come on and talk a bit about the work that he's been doing. Thomas, there are a bunch of ODS bodies. The Appeals Centre Europe is one of them. How did it come to be, and how did you come to be working at one of the ODS bodies?
Well, Ben, thank you. I guess the genesis for the Appeals Centre Europe goes back, for me personally, would go back to Article 19, where we actually looked at and tried to think through what regulatory models might look like to pursue greater transparency and accountability for the very large online platforms. But in more recent years, really a group of us who were with the Oversight Board we've kind of realized that at that time, and paid close attention to emerging regulation coming up around the world, but realized at that time that a statutory underpinning in a co-regulatory structure would give us the sort of the strongest basis for being able to really pursue, that greater transparency and accountability through an oversight over the content moderation decisions that platforms take. And obviously those decisions impact people, everyday individuals, but also communities and societies in a very, very real and meaningful way. And I think that's extremely well understood and documented now. So this for me is one of the most important elements of the Digital Services Act, along with some of other components that I think we'll get to later in the podcast. So what we did as we tracked this emerging regulation was really keep a close eye on the European Union, of course, kind of well-established assumptions underpinning the thinking that what the European Union does, has a ripple effect around the world. It's not to say that all jurisdictions and countries will follow suit precisely, but they can help create a certain pattern to regulation. And if that regulation is good, right, then of course that could be a welcome ripple effect. And within the EU legislation, obviously the Digital Services Act, seemed to be and is the most relevant piece of legislation that we pay close attention to. And at the same time, within that, Article 21 on out-of-court dispute settlement, and also Articles 34 and 35 on systemic risks, and again, we get back to that later, seem to be the parts that spoke most closely to the type of work that certainly the Oversight Board was doing at that time. So essentially, we took the opportunity to utilize resources from the Oversight Board Trust to have a one-time irrevocable grant to get this new body set up to seek certification in Ireland from the Commission Amman. That was quite a lengthy and in-depth process that we went through in 2024 to establish our independence and our impartiality and our expertise. And then we launched an entirely separate new institution at the very tail end of last year, and that institution is the Appeal Centre Europe. And Ben, as you said, there's a half dozen out-of-court dispute settlement bodies now in existence in the EU. We have a network actually where we meet very regularly amongst one another. We're all different in genesis and different in background, and we have sort of different approaches, but that diversity is very welcome.
Yeah, really helpful overview, Thomas. Listeners might be interested to know a bit about who's reviewing these cases and kind of what their expertise is. I think there's maybe an interesting discussion we had there, but can you give a sense of how the process works and who's receiving these cases from users, and then what the kind of steps are before they get some feedback about whether the platform's policies were followed or not?
Sure. So one of the exciting things about out-of-court dispute settlement is that, of course, it creates for users, whether that be an individual or an organization, really for the first time, an actionable, realistic, timely, free path to be able to raise a dispute about a content moderation action on one of the large platforms. And Ben, as you mentioned at the start, that's either to dispute the removal of their content or the suspension of their account, or to dispute a piece of harmful content that they see remaining online on the platform that they think is policy violating and should be removed. And essentially, a user can come to appealcentre.eu after having reported it to the platform and then raise a dispute with us. We will then receive that dispute depending on the nature of the dispute. After having requested the data from the platform that's connected to that dispute, we'll then review it. It'll go through various pathways of escalation depending on context and language and so on and so forth. And as an outcome of that, we will issue then a decision back to both user and platform. Those decisions, as you mentioned, are non-binding. But I think the really interesting component here is that there is a tie-back in the legislation between Article 21 and Articles 34 and 35. So between out-of-court dispute settlement and the decisions themselves and systemic risks. And the individual decision, of course, in giving redress to an individual user about a piece of content that really affects them personally in their life, or maybe an organization that is trying to campaign against different types of harmful content that they see online, like getting that content either removed or restored, that is extremely important. That is an individual's right. But there's a secondary element to this, which is that decisions, particularly those that are not implemented by the platforms, they, I think, will create over time a bit of a heat map. So what I mean by that is you'll be able to take those decisions and say, well, why is this platform not removing all of this hate speech targeting this community and this language in this city, in this country, or whatever it may be? That is a systemic risk, right? And when I read the legislation and look at what forms a potential systemic risk, right? Fundamental rights, they're clearly defined, right? They are in there. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is a systemic risk. So I would expect then under Articles 34 and then 35, the auditor who looks at those systemic risks and the regulator by extension to be saying to the platform, well, you failed to mitigate this systemic risk, which that ODS body has repeatedly told you is violating content.
Interesting. So essentially we'll start to see types of harm and also maybe countries, regions, geographies within the kind of European system where platforms are failing to mitigate those risks. Is that what you're saying? That kind of we'll start to spot in a way that is probably difficult to do now beyond big news events that maybe Mike and I talk about and that crop up from time to time. We'll be able to spot those more easily.
Yeah, I believe so. And I also believe that the data that we produce can also help other actors, like vetted researchers, for instance. Obviously, the type of data that we will produce, and we have the aspiration to be releasing data in as much depth and breadth and as frequency as we can. The transparency report we put out last week, that's just the first one. It's obviously a kind of a veneer of the type of data that we hope to be able to release in future. But certainly we think that creates a bit of a heat map that then researchers can go to platforms and say, well, we can see there might be a problem over here, or there seems to be an issue emerging over there from out-of-court dispute settlement. Like, we want to go deep. Like, obviously the data we have will never have the same breadth and relevance as the platform's own data. That has to be the primary source, the real source. But certainly we can help point vetted researchers, regulators, media, others to where issues may exist. So this is the way in which the DSA kind of locks together.
Got it. And the report you mentioned is fascinating. Alice Hunsberger, who writes Trust and Safety Insider, reflected on the report in her newsletter this week. Essentially, you've shared a breakdown of the 10,000 or so disputes that have been submitted across various platforms over the last 10 months. You've kind of acted on 3,300 of those. They are the eligible ones. A lot of people are clearly submitting cases that aren't eligible under your scope. But there's some really interesting trends in there. I wonder if you could give me a couple of highlights that you were, particularly surprised by.
Certainly, yeah. So I think from my perspective, I think that this initial transparency report really demonstrates, one, that people, users, organizations want this and it's very relevant to them and that they are starting to make use of it. And as you can see from the report, month on month, there's a clear increase. And I also think it demonstrates that the sector can work, right? It can function and it can do what it's set out to be able to, I think, what the original drafters of the legislation wanted it to do. Now, that's not to say there aren't teething problems. There certainly are, right? And as you will see from the data and the reporting, in many of the cases, we've had to issue a default decision because either the platform was just technically unable to find the content, even though we had established that there was an eligible dispute, or they disputed our scope and said that they wouldn't give us the content. So, this is a journey where there needs to be improvement. But the sort of the glass half full interpretation of that, of course, is that in half the cases, they did find the content and we did issue a decision, right? And as you'll see from the transparency report, and I would encourage all listeners to go and read the transparency report in its depth. But as you'll see from the transparency report, I think some of the interesting trends are things like in 3/4 of the cases, we were overturning platform decisions. Now, I have to say that statistic is somewhat masked by the default decisions because where the platforms don't engage, we issue a default. But there's a more granular feel in there. Again, it's a veneer, but a more granular feel where we are upholding platform decisions and where we're overturning them. I think another big thing to call out is, as everyone will be aware, the DSA has been accused of being a sort of a censorship tool, right? And as somehow being contrary to freedom of expression. And that is not the intent, obviously, of the legislation. It's to promote and protect freedom of expression. And you can see that actually we are, where we are overturning a platform decision, in 3/4 of the time, we are restoring content to the platform. Mm-hmm. So the idea that out-of-court dispute settlement as a component of the DSA is sort of censoring en masse and taking down content is just false. It's just wrong.
Yeah, interesting. And the report is great. And as you say, it's the first one. Alice made the point that this is a very small set of data points, but I think it's an important starting point. And, nothing good ever came from, starting in this with the big bang. So I really recommend people to read it. I'm really glad to have you on the podcast to talk about some of those issues that you've spoken about already, Thomas. And I think that's probably a good point to segue into our first story today and for this week. If that ACE report, Thomas, is showing how platforms are being moderated, there is a kind of broader question about how the public thinks they should be moderated. And that's kind of really the topic of a recent report from the Reuters Institute. As all of our stories today, that we'll share the links in the show notes, as we always do, this is a piece of research based on a survey that asks users whether they want platforms to be the kind of leaders of the content policy or whether they want governments to have a bigger say in what content is allowed on platforms. The survey looks at 8 countries, and it kind of looks at both who should control content policy, but also whether government should play a bigger role in who decides where content is false or misleading and how that should come down. And in many ways, Thomas, I thought this was a bit of a false kind of framing at the start. The questions and the way it was framed, I was somewhat kind of thinking that this wouldn't give us any interesting data. But the results are actually fascinating. And I'll kind of give listeners a bit of a flavor. The kind of TLDR, the thing that really stands out across all of the responses is that between half and 2/3 of people in all 8 countries think the platform should be responsible for content policy. And that is both, I think, surprising in some ways and not surprising in others. I think it's surprising how close all of those countries are in seeming that platforms should take the lead on content policy. There isn't a huge variation, as the research makes clear, between Japan, Korea, the UK, Brazil, the US. Everyone is fairly aligned in terms of the platform should be taking the lead on it. There are some regional variations, though. We see kind of the UK and Germany being slightly more pro-government, only by a few percentage points, but wanting the government to play a slightly more kind of impactful role in deciding that content policy regime. Another piece that's surprising is the US. 28% of people wanted to have the government take the lead in taking greater responsibility for policy and guidance about what's allowed online. So the research is somewhat counterintuitive, but it also falls kind of relatively in line with what we might expect users to think about in a kind of information environment where platforms are so dominant. And the timing, I think, is obviously fascinating with, as you say, the regulatory kind of regime across the world shifting so much, and we'll touch on that in other stories. Basically, platforms still retain the confidence of users. And I wondered, as somebody who's been looking at this in their report recently and in their work, what you made of that.
Yeah, Ben, it is a fascinating piece. And again, I would, like you, encourage everyone to read it and look at the data, mainly because of the uniformity of the data across all demographics and countries. It's an interesting point. I guess my first self-reflection is those of us who are sort of more steeped into the regulatory trust and safety ecosystem, we live and breathe the problems of platforms on a daily basis, right? And that is always our attention and focus and where there are failings. And I think part of what the research does is just gently remind us that for many people, social media is a positive, right? And that they find good online and that they enjoy their engagement on social media and think it has value in society. So I think it's always worth having that small reminder to ourselves that whilst we maybe feel we're obviously battling these giants in some ways, some people are actually enjoying being on those systems and using those tools. But when I read it, as interesting as the research is, it's also binary, right? And here, of course, I'm going to come back to co-regulatory structures and third parties in those systems. And I don't read the data, and I don't think you do either, Ben. But I don't read the data as a confidence vote in the platforms themselves. Rather, I read it as two things. One is I think there's a healthy skepticism of direct governmental control over speech. And I think many of the respondents, I assume, I would like to think many of the respondents are aware that if you directly empower government to control speech, and particularly what constitutes harmful rather than illegal speech, then that's a slippery slope. Then we have real problems with, civic discourse, democracy and so on and so forth in society. And if you look actually at the data and as it sort of speaks to the misinformation piece, the other component of it, I think you see that coming out a little bit, right? I mean, the platforms are not getting a free pass here, that the users are not looking at them and saying, oh, they're sort of not culpable or responsible for any of the problems that are playing out on their platforms, or any of the speech that is being put up on the platforms.
Right.
But I think the other piece that's kind of missing, and I would love to see the Reuters Institute to put this in next time around, and the Knight Foundation, of course. But the other piece that I think is missing is what people would respond to the idea of out-of-court dispute settlement bodies. It's third parties. They're not government. They're not platforms. Obviously, it's co-regulatory. They're certified by the regulator, but hopefully done so through a clear and fair, transparent process, and are accountable for their certification, and they're given certification for a period of time, and then given certainly for out-of-court dispute settlement, built into the legislation, given a business model, a funding model through the legislation itself. And I would hope that people would say, well, great, actually, if as long as you've got confidence in those bodies and that system works well, that actually is the best outcome here. That's the best solution. Neither party is solely unto themselves going to be taking responsibility and issuing decisions without any kind of accountability overseeing them.
Yeah, and I think this is where the ODS bodies are so interesting, right? Because they have so much potential, and I'm sure you think that as well. But there's not many people that seem to know about them. You know, your report talks about this as well, and this is why I think these two stories work well together. Is that the platforms are not necessarily promoting ODS bodies as a mechanism for users to kind of seek redress for decisions they make, even though they're meant to. And obviously, you know, reaching a kind of critical mass of people online is difficult and costly and not something that the individual ODS bodies can do. How do you see that barrier being broken through so that, as you say, the users in this Reuters report can have the best of both?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, building up user awareness is a crucial component in this. And we are obviously trying hard together with other ODS bodies to get the message out there, as it were, to users. And we do see it coming, right? I mean, users are becoming more aware. But a crucial component in this, and as you say, this is called out in our report, is what we've deemed signposting. So on-platform information about out-of-court dispute settlement and how a user, if they disagree with the decision that the platform has taken, can raise that dispute to an ODS body, in this case to the Appeal Centre Europe. And the platforms, you know, in our appreciation of it, simply have to do better, right? They've all put some form of information, right? They're all minimally compliant. Some platforms are certainly doing better than others, and I would encourage, again, everyone to read the report. We've got quite a granular description of how platforms are performing, not only on this scale, actually, but also on the sort of the data sharing and sort of technology engagement piece as well. And it varies by platform, but I would say they've all, the ones we're currently working with, they've all sort of got themselves over that minimal hurdle. But if that signposting were improved, if it were better, you know, I think it's pretty clear that would then result in higher numbers of disputes coming from users, right? Greater awareness and then greater use of the systems.
Yeah, I think so too. You kind of touched on there, we talked a bit about the kind of US element, and, you know, you've worked at the oversight board. You're probably familiar with, you've worked in the US, you've got an understanding of how the US kind of sees speech and understands speech. Were you surprised about the high number of survey responses that thought the government should play a larger role in how policy and guidance should be conceived? That was a bit of a shock to me, that it was, you know, higher than other countries like Brazil, where we know there are big pushbacks against big tech companies. What did you make of that?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see this data sort of correlated against, you know, trust in government, trust in institutions, stability of government, rule of law. Like, I think these things certainly have an impact on whether people around the world want direct government control over speech or not, right? And I would assume that where countries have sort of, where they're probably smaller, where they have maybe more liberal systems, where there's rule of law is stronger, like people will be more comfortable with direct governmental control or oversight, and it pushes in the other direction. But your point on the US is a really interesting one, because I would not have expected that, right? Because obviously First Amendment rights are so ingrained and so strongly held that you would have thought there would be great skepticism about any kind of governmental engagement. But I can only assume that maybe that is a reflection of a sense of frustration amongst people that, at least at a federal level, things have not progressed, right? Maybe in relation to children and minors and so on, but really across every other front, I think it's widely understood to have stagnated. So maybe there is frustration that government has failed to act, and that now we are seeing this playing out through state level legislation and obviously through the courts.
I think that's right. And then, and unfortunately, we don't have a political breakdown in the US. That the report, at least the version we see, doesn't have that. But there is an interesting discrepancy between survey respondents who class themselves as kind of politically left and politically right. And there is basically a kind of between a 9 and 13 percentage point difference between those who are happy to have government intervention, those people on the left, as you say, and those who are on the right and who probably shy away from that. Do you think that's something that is likely to kind of increase over time as well? It's fairly well pronounced as this data presents it, but based upon what we hear in other forms, particularly in the US, but in other countries as well, do you think that is likely to kind of grow over time?
I mean, it could well do, but I think, again, that sort of political spectrum breakdown is probably a result of the fact that on both sides of the line, on left and right, there is a feeling that, you know, the online certainly social media information ecosystems disfavor them, right, are weighted against them. And you can make the argument for both ways. And then there is counter arguments and counter research for both as well.
Yeah.
But here, just based purely on, not on the reality, but the perception, right? The perception is these systems don't work in my favor. Something has to change. Someone needs to hold them to account. And if you're going to, there's only really kind of three major groups that can hold social media platforms to account. One is their users en masse, unlikely to happen because that would require an enormous amount of social unrest and coordination. Maybe not social unrest, but coordination amongst people. The second one is advertisers. And we've seen moments in the past where they sort of stood up, but then they sort of sit down again as best they can. And the other one is governments or regulators, right? And those are the three. And maybe there's a fourth, which is other tech, right? Both in competition and in cooperation. So the obvious one, I think, for the person on the street, assuming that's who was actually surveyed for these results, is the government. Right? I mean, how are you going to hold big tech to account? The government. The government should do something about it. Yeah.
I think there's that as the only real discrepancy in the breakdown of the data is, I think, one of the standout pieces there. And there's a thread that I think would be interesting to see pulled on. I think there is plans for Reuters to do this again in the future. So we'll have this as a benchmark to move on. Really interesting piece of research. As I said, I was surprised that there was so many interesting elements of it, despite what I thought was a fairly binary framing of the question. So glad to be proved wrong as ever, Thomas. We've talked a bit about kind of regulation there in the context of what users want. One of the largest well-known pieces of speech regulation, the DSA, actually turned 3 this week. It was passed in 2022 and came into force in February 2023. So actually the kind of 3-year anniversary is a bit like when you start going out with somebody, when you become exclusive with somebody, but you don't start going out. So it's the kind of fake anniversary that comes before you kind of commit to somebody, I would say. You still have to remember it though, because, you always do. But there's a kind of milestone in many ways for speech regulation. And Algorithm Watch, really well known, and I think does some great work, non-profit organization, has written a piece about kind of what's been learnt in those 3 years, what the DSA has managed to do, what it's failed to do, what's down the track. And I know this is something that you are kind of reading with good interest, Thomas.
Absolutely. So I think this piece that Algorithm Watch put out is certainly really interesting. They quite rightly call out this anniversary as I think in a way as a sort of a momentous but maybe slightly flat occasion in terms of progress. And they do some analysis around obviously the DSA and particularly dive into 2 areas that we've already mentioned already. But for me, in terms of the Digital Services Act, I still think actually it's the best. It's a complex piece of legislation, right? And although I would actually describe it in my own mind as kind of it's got a series of beautiful sort of interlocking cogs that if they turn together, I think are going to make a really, really powerful system of regulation that is arm's length and provides the independence and the guarantees that we want. But nevertheless, it's obviously going to take time for that to happen. And I think one of the real challenges is that, in my mind, I conceptualize it in a certain way, but everyone else seems to be conceptualizing it in their own way as well. So how this actually pans out in the end is going to be obviously really interesting to see. But for me, obviously, you've got those kind of internal pieces. So you've got the compliance requirements on the platforms themselves, so like points of contact and transparency reporting and notice and action, internal appeals and access to data like we talked about. But all those kind of parts that I think there is probably broad agreement that platforms must be doing, should be doing. And then it's got what I think of as the kind of external both entities and functions that have been created somewhere between obviously the platforms themselves and then the statutory regulator and then governments by extension. Yeah. And those are things in my mind like, trusted flaggers, obviously looking for illegal content, the vetted researchers, the auditors to doing the systemic risks, and then of course the out-of-court dispute settlement bodies as well. And each of these is an independent separate body from the regulator, right, that maybe needs to be certified or approved in some way, and they need to have their work, obviously, to some degree overseen in an arm's length manner, but is nevertheless not the regulator, not appointed by the government and so on, or not appointed also directly by the European Commission or the digital service coordinators at a national level. And that is the ecosystem that you want to create, right? That is the co-regulatory structure that we've seen work, I think, relatively well. I mean, it's open to debate, but relatively well in the media sector as a comparator. that you really want to see sort of replicated for social media. And I think, as the article points out, we've got to give it a bit more time, right? And also it requires, I think, lots of different actors to lean in and engage. And I think that the DSA is a little maligned at the moment because there's kind of assumption that, like, why has nothing happened and why isn't things changing? But if you take us as an example, obviously as soon as February 2024 passed, we got our application in, within a few weeks. Then we went through the certification process. Then after the summer of last year, we got approval. Then we ran hell for leather to get set up and build our systems and recruit all of our team and staff and so on and so forth. And then we launched at the end of last year, and now we've had just over half a year of active work, of which a lot of that is building up. So it's very easy to break those 3 years down into little chunks and say, actually, things are moving quickly. 3 years sounds a long time, but things are moving fast. And if you look at the number of at least RFIs that have gone out from the European Commission and the number of investigations that they've opened, it's a pretty considerable number, right? I think it's almost up to 100. So they're not sitting idle, right? I don't think anyone could accuse the officials in Brussels or elsewhere dotted around the EU of sort of not wanting and not being willing to pursue and take action, and potentially enforcement action as well. But we're still in these early days, right? And also, very importantly, one of the areas that the article calls out, of course, is Article 40 on vetted researchers. Like, we've only just seen the Delegated Act on Data Access coming out. And now I assume that the DSEs, and particularly the Commission of Mine in Ireland, they're going to get a deluge of requests to get access to that data and for researchers to start utilizing it. And I know that there's still a lot to do in relation to really understanding like how those access requests are granted and what breadth and depth they have and what the platforms will provide in response. But again, it's taken time, but like we start to see this connecting. And as I said earlier, I see a direct connection between out-of-court dispute settlement and the disputes and what vetted researchers are going to do and what data they might seek. And then on the back of the data, I can imagine a world in which they put out policy advice and we look at that policy advice as we issue decisions. And then a vetted researcher looks at that policy and goes to get more data. And same with trusted flaggers. You can see how all these things start to lock together and actually create a really vibrant and strong ecosystem, which the platforms should benefit from, right? If they lean in, if they look at this in a constructive way, would be useful for them as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, this idea of a kind of ecosystem and almost like a flywheel perhaps taking place, right? If all the parts work in the way that you say. I mean, as an onlooker, I've certainly been surprised at the kind of speed that things have happened. It does feel slow. I know that that's probably in a world where everything happens immediately, but the trusted flaggers, the digital service coordinators who are kind of put in post in various countries to approve things like the trusted flaggers and the ODS bodies, of which ACE is one, they have taken a while to be embedded and to be often kind of set up. I think even a few months ago, there were countries that didn't have a DSE in place. We're talking, 3 years on now. So are things happening fast enough, really, to particularly in a world when the platforms will work always at a faster speed than regulators? And what can be done to kind of help address some of those kind of speed issues that it feels like kind of regulators are falling behind on?
Yeah, I think comparatively, if you compare this to sort of ABMSD implementation or even ADR implementation from an EU perspective, like this is moving faster than those did. The responsibility to push the member states falls to the European Commission. And I believe that they are pushing. And I don't have an in-depth oversight over all of the member states, but I think the majority have moved and have DSCs in place. But we certainly send information to an awful lot of DSCs and they respond to us, right? For instance, we shared our transparency report quite broadly and many of them wrote back to us and thanked us. So they're getting up and running and paying attention. I think it's a resourcing question. There's lots of elements within this. And trying to resource and be engaged across all of the different aspects is very challenging. But some of the key DSEs, and here I would call out the Commission of Mine in Ireland, they have moved fast and they have built up their resources quite broadly. And they have a lot of expertise in-house in a way that their predecessors, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, maybe didn't have in terms of social media. So it's a very different looking regulatory landscape. Now, it's got complexity because they have to coordinate amongst each other and they have to try and harmonize to a degree across different standards that they're applying and hold a coherent line with the platforms and so on and so forth. So yes, there's lots of coordination that needs to take place. But my sense is that they are trying to move and they are not sort of dragging their heels. But I, like you, we have areas where, and it's called out in our report, for instance, where we don't think platforms are doing enough. In fact, we very directly call out YouTube for really being very slow on getting up and running and sharing any data. Actually, YouTube, unlike the other platforms that we work with, has shared no data with us, and we don't have a data sharing agreement and arrangements in place. And I'm gonna very defensively say that after we released our report, they said that we didn't have the right security and privacy protections in place. That is very disingenuous as a response, because we have put in place in a shorter, much shorter time frame, the requirements with other platforms, and actually we have very high, robust data protection standards and security standards in place at the Appeal Center Europe. The problem with our engagement with YouTube to date is that it's been punctuated by very long periods of silence, right? And we would love to complete that process as fast as possible. Sorry, that was a bit of a frustration. That was a bit of a divergence. And there are problems with the other platforms as well, right? We have issues across the board, some small, some large, so on and so forth. So I think pressure on platforms to comply is another crucial component of this, right, in order to get this up and running.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned the ADR, the Alternative Dispute Resolution, which is a kind of EU mechanism for consumer disputes, right? Which I'm only vaguely familiar with. But I think the point there is, the expectations are that the EU is able to set up a regime like this fairly quickly. And actually, from what you're saying, the way that it's been done so far, the first few years has been pretty speedy, has been pretty effective in comparison to kind of other, perhaps non-technology related regimes. It's a case of expectations, I think, from what you're saying. I want to come back to the kind of point around, we talked about platform compliance, particularly around the ODS. There's an element of that here in this algorithm watch piece. What do you think the kind of cause of this enforcement lag is? We see platforms not responding in the way that you'd expect to bodies like your own, giving data, acting in good faith as the legislation lays out, kind of engaging in a way that, is specified in the Digital Services Act. When do we think we'll kind of start to see that being enforced more heavily? Or is, as Mike and I always talk about, is that the point of regulation? Is that the threat is the thing?
Yeah, no, of course. So it's not a binary black and white scenario of complying, not complying, right? If you were to ask me the question, are the platforms engaged, right? Do you have a constructive relationship with them? Are they complying at a sort of a basic level? I would say yes. Yes, they are, right? They set up teams, we built systems, we send them disputes, they send us data back, we issue decisions, they implement those decisions. So that system works. Is it fully compliant? Is it as broad as it needs to be? Is it as swift as it needs to be and as timely as it needs to be? No, it's not. But it's only been operational for now, more than half, 3/4 of a year, right, realistically. So It's only been operational for what is in reality a short period of time. Now, don't get me wrong. I do not want to sit here and sound like I'm apologizing for platforms, because I want them to move much faster, right? This is not fast enough. It's not good enough. They need to do better. But in the bigger picture of things, it is working, right? It's starting to show its potential. And the easy part is that, when you're bridging a gap between two bodies and how to interpret a piece of legislation, the easy part is the initial part. It's like, so what's minimal compliance on your side look like? And what's our expectations on our side to get up and running? Okay, you get that, you bridge that quite quickly. That I would characterize as kind of like YouTuber side. That I would characterize as the first kind of like first quarter of this year, first 4 months. Next period was like, okay, so where are we actually disagreeing? Why won't you give us this content? Why aren't you giving us this content? Like, why aren't you able to find this content, right? And I think some of the platforms, to be really honest, and I obviously I can't speak for them, they haven't said this directly to me, but I think they've been like, oh my God, like, why can't we find this content? Like, it's an eligible dispute. We don't dispute that it's an eligible dispute, but our systems somehow are not constructed that we can find this type of content in this environment for this reason. Like, so they're figuring out how they build those systems in the back end in their content moderation can find a piece of content. Sometimes we have the URL where we can see the content on the platform, but they can't find it in the system. So, they've got to close this gap, right? And that's a technical issue. And then there's the legal issue, right? So we're also going toe to toe with, legal teams, and they're saying, well, that's not in scope. We're like, no, that is in scope, right? It's a pretty broad piece of legislation. If you want to dispute things being in scope, pretty confident we're going to see this one through. But no, that is in scope. And so there's that. So it's this bit, right? This is the hard part to close the gap. And we're only now seeing, I think, a bit more of a discussion sort of, now we've come to this kind of loggerheads, a bit more of a serious discussion where I think we might make some progress now in the shorter term. I don't think we're ever necessary, ever. It's going to take a very long time to entirely close that gap. But if we can get that gap here from, let's say 50% of the decisions are being issued, right? So let's say we're 50% of the way there, right?
Yeah.
I think we can probably, through this next period, get to 70%. And then I think we're going to have a really hard time closing off the last 30%. That would be my expectation.
Okay, interesting. So a fairly long way to go, but as far as the DSA is concerned, a better than terrible start. If not as maybe as dire as Algorithm Watch has painted in this piece, but a helpful kind of analysis and context from you there, Thomas. I'm going to kind of flip us to talking about a few smaller stories that help kind of round up today's podcast. Mike and I tend to do this as speedily as possible, but we never succeed. So there's really no pressure for you to do the same. But I wanted to kind of highlight a story that has been doing the rounds. I've been sent it by a few people this week, which is a Discord data breach. Now, the video kind of chat platform suffered a breach a couple of weeks ago on the 20th of September. This week, they announced that it had happened. And it's a fairly kind of standard data breach in the sense that it is email, username, IP address of a segment of its users. I think what's notable and what makes it relevant to Ctrl-Alt-Speech is that this was as a result of a kind of breach from a third-party customer service platform that it seems to be that the trust and safety team used. And the reason why that is because they have announced that a small number of personal IDs, so driving license, passport, have been stolen as a result of that. And these are personal details that have been provided to Discord as part of disputes about age verification. So listeners would have heard over the last kind of probably 6 months or so, in various countries, age verification has become mandatory under regulation in those countries, notably the UK and Australia. So platforms have decided to roll out age verification systems on their platforms for accessing various content. Those personal pieces of data, passport, driving license, are not kept as standard. They're not held by platforms, and Discord makes that very clear when you provide that data. However, if you appeal that age verification, if you fall foul of it, if you're deemed to be too young, which I would not be, but if you're deemed to be too young, then you can appeal, and as such, some of that data has been stored, and that has been part of the breach. So it's interesting in a number of regards. The people who are skeptical of age verification, and I have qualms about it in some of these regards as well, are saying, here we go. This is the issue with age verification. You know, you're going to create more issues for more people because the privacy and security issues that come with collecting people's data are such that you try and protect a small segment of people and you end up jeopardizing everyone else. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that here because it is a quite obscure set of users who have appealed. However, it is something that Discord should have covered off, and it should be something that they shouldn't have been collecting and storing. I don't know how much you've been keeping track of the age verification debate, Thomas. Has it crossed your paths? What do you make of this?
It's not crossed my path in the Appeal Center Europe world, but certainly something you kind of missed, obviously, in the broader debate, and also in the UK as of late, you know, as the Online Safety Act rules came into force through the summer about age verification. Look, I've always thought that doing the verification at the device level, it seemed to be the logical way to go. I think the point in this article also is that there shouldn't be dependency on just one form, and that if you do use a certain form, you need fallback options that are readily available and quick and easy to use for individuals. So I'm gonna go for the get out phrase of saying this is a knotty issue and it's going to take some time to resolve.
Yeah, I think this is it's unfortunate for the platform and a kind of perfectly bow-tied present for people who want to be kind of skeptical of age verification for some good reasons. But notable story that has been covered in a lot of places, including The Guardian, where we read it. We'll round up, Thomas, on a story that I'm going to kind of classify as a geez, America, you've done it again story. I think this is a broader political story that has a platform element. And much like you talked about YouTube earlier, which is not a platform that regularly gets a lot of heat, I would say, for its speech policy application, this one concerns Apple. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is obviously the removal of the de-ISA civic reporting app from the Apple Store. And it's an interesting one because I would love to sit down with the lawyers in Apple who decided that, if that's what they have decided, of course, that being a police officer is a protected characteristic under any kind of human rights framework, because I think it's kind of clearly established, actually, that police officers are not a protected characteristic. In fact, professions generally are not. You know, we would normally think of things like, you know, race, ethnicity, disability, religion, these types of things as being protected characteristics. But looking at the Apple policies, I think this was taken down under the first amendment, the policy 1.1. And I do wonder to some degree whether they've decided to apply a kind of a quasi hate speech type of policy area to this, because it just gives them a lower threshold in which to apply. Because essentially, you would only need to sort of demonstrate, and I'm not being on the de-ISA app, so I don't know what kind of content's there, but you would only need to demonstrate that there's kind of harm or accusations of harm or criminality or dehumanizing content or maybe, slurs and so on and so forth. Things that you might imagine, if content can be shared on this app, might be available, because I'm assuming people using the app are not enamored with the actions of ICE. Yeah. Whereas under the Apple policy that deals with encouraging violence, you would actually, I think, normally expect a tech platform to have under their kind of violence and incitement policies something that might actually apply to police and potential harm to law enforcement officers. But it's going to have almost certainly a very high threshold. It's almost certainly going to have like imminent harm as a threshold. And maybe Apple, and here I'm just wildly guessing, of course, but maybe Apple felt that they would not be able to establish the de-ISA app as presenting imminent harm to ICE agents and police officers, but maybe they thought there was some unpleasant commentary going on about those ICE agents and police officers. But in general, with my own background in human rights promotion and defense, I would actually argue, obviously, that police officers are state actors, right? And often are perpetrators of rights abuses. I'm not suggesting that's necessarily the case here, but in general, right? So, and actually accountability and transparency over their actions and oversight over their actions and empowering individuals to be able to hold those actors to account and defend their rights is actually really important. I mean, it's like a crucial underpinning of democratic society. So, I don't think we can award any merit stars to Apple for this decision.
No, definitely not. I mean, the idea that kind of an app designed for civic reporting made by one developer that was on the App Store that has been taken down in this way amidst the sea of other apps that presumably are live and available for potentially similar things does raise alarm bells, particularly when you think about, the US administration and its connections to big tech platforms, including Apple and including Tim Cook. There's basically no tech platform that hasn't seemingly kowtowed to the US president in recent months. But I think that's what the concern here is, that there has been a concerted effort to take down an app for reasons that are perhaps a little bit unclear, at least. And this is as a result of some great reporting by Migrant Insider, which is a kind of independent publication. There's also a really interesting letter from a former Apple employee, which we'll include in the show notes, that calls on Apple to explain its decisions. He's an Apple shareholder. He obviously kind of thinks that Apple were one of the good guys, as many people do. And this kind of behavior doesn't chime with that, I would say. So, not a great look for Apple, not a great look for the US at this same time. And we can say that, Thomas, because Mike's not here, and he was slating Brits. He was slating Brits on the podcast last week, so I feel like we can give it a bit back.
Only fair.
It's fair game, after all. Thomas, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. We've gone deep on two really interesting stories from the Reuters Institute, from Algorithm Watch. We've talked a bit about the Discord breach and also the Apple ICE agent story. Some amazing reporting and news media organizations that have allowed us to understand what's going on in the trust and safety world. Go and subscribe to them, go and read them. It allows us to kind of talk a bit about it on the podcast. Thank you for your time, Thomas. Really appreciate it. That URL again, appealscentereurope.eu, center spelled CENTRE for our US listeners. And thanks very much for taking the time today.
Ben, thank you very much. I hope I've been sufficiently Mike adjacent, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Excellent. Well, thanks for your time. We look forward to having you on the podcast again. Listeners, if you enjoyed today's podcast, rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, wherever you listen. We look forward to having you back next week, where Mike will be in the chair once again. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's CTRL-Alt-Speech.com.